Before we dive into the case, I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service, and it's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. Nor do you have to try and fit in an appointment into your already hectic schedule. With BetterHelp, you'll have access to an entire network of more than 25,000 licensed, experienced therapists who will be able to help you with whatever you're dealing with. With the holidays over now and Old Man Winter in full force, it's easy to get down this time of year, and we all need someone who can understand what you're going through and can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer a few simple questions about your needs and preferences in therapy. I know the questions seem never-ending and take forever, but there's a reason for that. BetterHelp just wants to be able to match you with the therapist that's right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with the one that you have, or maybe they're not fitting your needs, then you can change your therapist at any time with BetterHelp at no additional cost. You also don't have to wait any period of time to switch your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, then you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time. And as I mentioned earlier, you can schedule live sessions with your therapist when it's convenient for you and your schedule. They're there for you on your time. With BetterHelp, you'll get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, more scheduling flexibility, and more affordable pricing. If you go to their website and use code betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know you heard it at the campfire, but you'll receive 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. And I'll also provide a link into the show notes. The Jersey Devil, also known as the Leeds Devil, is a legendary creature said to inhabit the forests of the Pine Barrens in South Jersey. The creature is often described as a flying biped with hooves, but there are many variations. The common description is that of a bipedal kangaroo-like or wyvern-like creature with a horse or goat-like head, a leathery bat-like wings, horns, small arms with clawed hands, legs with cloven hooves, and a forked or pointed tail. It has been reported to move quickly and is often described as emitting a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream. According to popular folklore, the Jersey Devil was originated with a Pine Barrens resident named Jane Leeds, known as Mother Leeds. The legend started and states that Mother Leeds had 12 children, and after discovering that she was pregnant with the 13th child, the child would be cursed, stating that the child would be the devil. In 1735, Mother Leeds was in labor on a stormy night while her friends gathered around her. Born as a normal child, the 13th child transformed into a creature with hooves, a goat's head, bat wings, and a forked tail. Growling and screaming, the child beat everyone with the tail before flying up the chimney and heading into the pine. In some versions of this tale, Mother Leeds was supposedly a witch, and the child's father was the devil himself. Some versions of the legend also state that local clergymen subsequently attempted to exorcise the creature from the Pine Barrens. Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year to all the great people gathering around the campfire this evening. Tonight, we go back to my old stomping grounds in New Jersey. But not Long Valley this time. But don't worry, we'll be making a trip back there in the future soon enough, as Long Valley has some more dark secrets and scars that need their stories told. Tonight we're in Jefferson Township, New Jersey, and we're taking a ride on the Campfire Time Machine and going back to 1988 on a cold and dark winter night in January for a case that seems like it could only come out of a horror movie. Imagine sleeping peacefully in the start of a new year and you have all these plans and goals you've set for yourself, and then you are awakened to smoke alarms going off. Imagine waking up to a house in a blaze. Much like Long Valley, we are visiting another quiet town deep in the woods of Jefferson Township, where what happened would be referred to as the Satanic Panic and would leave a dark cloud hanging over it. Welcome to the campfire. Grab your s'mores and grab a seat. Thanks for joining me tonight around the fire where we discuss the dark world of true crime. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast. And this is the case of Betty-Ann Sullivan. The Sullivans were a normal suburban family. Betty-Ann Sullivan and Thomas Sullivan Sr. were married for over a decade with two boys, Thomas Jr., who was 14, and Brian, who was 8 years old in the winter of 1988. On the cold night of January 9th, 1988, Thomas Sr. was awoken from a deep sleep just a little before midnight, between 10 and 10:30 p.m., to the piercing, screeching sound of a smoke alarm. Thomas went to investigate the reason for the smoke alarms going off, not realizing his wife had not come to bed yet. He realized that there was a fire set in the living room, although contained at the moment, he realized it had the potential to spread quickly. Thomas Sr. ran down the hallway to wake his wife, only then realizing that she wasn't in bed, then went to Tommy's room and also found it empty. When Thomas Sr. went outside, he realized his car had been backed out of the spot that it was sitting in and was across the street on a snowbank by the neighbor's house. It would take him several minutes to realize that someone stole the car and immediately crashed it, and then would take off on foot. This would be something for him to revisit later, as his house was still burning and his wife and kids are still unaccounted for. The Kennedys were known on the Milton side of Jefferson as well-renowned good people, and Ann Kennedy raised her 5 children as a single mother widow. On the night of January 9th, 3 of the Kennedy children, Bobby, Stuart, and Michael, walked down White Rock Boulevard to the Eastmans' residence to visit their friend Chris. The Eastmans were neighbors of the Sullivans. The Eastmans were frequently a hangout spot for the weekends for the local neighborhood children. And while the Kennedy children were walking up to the Eastmans' house, Stuart Kennedy saw the car parked askew in the driveway, but assumed it was someone at the Eastmans who just couldn't park very well. As Stuart was walking to the front door, the neighbor was running across the street, yelling and waving his arms, and then pounding on the door. The owner of the home answered and saw it was Tom, the neighbor, and he explained that someone tried burning down the house and that his family was gone and currently missing. In Jefferson, if there was a knock, it meant that something was wrong, and it was either the police or someone was in trouble, because in Jefferson, friends and neighbors just let themselves in. Nobody locked their doors. It was much like Long Valley when I lived there. Nobody ever locked their doors, and nobody worried about anything happening or breaking into a home, because that didn't happen then. Mr. Sullivan ran across the street with Stuart and Michael, while Bobby, who is the oldest brother, stayed to call the fire department. Stuart and Mr. Sullivan would attempt to contain the fire, while Michael would look downstairs for the family. The fire was extinguished pretty quickly and easily. As Mr. Sullivan and Stuart took a closer look, they realized it was satanic books and papers laid out in a circle burning. Now that the fire was extinguished, they could focus on looking for the family. Mr. Sullivan continues to call out for them, and his youngest son comes out of his bedroom unaware of anything going on. Mr. Sullivan asks him if he has seen his mother and the brother, and then that's when he tells Mr. Sullivan that Tommy was covered with blood, and that Tommy told him he cut his hand and his mother was taking him to the hospital for stitches. All realizing both cars were still parked outside, Mr. Sullivan knew this wasn't the case. The youngest son, still unaware of the events unraveling, goes back to bed. Mr. Sullivan and Stuart began walking downstairs. When they get about halfway down the steps, he looks to his left and sees his wife laying on the floor. It would be apparent that it was murder. At about that same time, Michael lets out a scream and runs out of the house, throwing the front door open. Stuart follows in suit, worried about his brother. While waiting for the police, Michael couldn't stop yelling about how there's a body downstairs. Officer Bart McConnelly wasn't even a mile away when the call came in, and he began headed to the Sullivan's residence. When the 10 code 1028 came across the radio, he thought maybe he misunderstood the dispatcher and asked for them to repeat. They repeated it, followed with more details on the call that he was responding to. This would be his first 1028 of his career. 1028 was the 10 code for murder. The dispatch report gave McConnelly a description of what was going on, that a civilian on scene was claiming a woman had been murdered at the Sullivan residence on White Rock Boulevard. When Officer McConnelly got to the Sullivan residence, he was alone, and not wanting to clear the house alone, he wanted one of the Kennedy boys to go in with him. The oldest brother laughed at McConnelly like he was joking. Eventually, Stuart went in with Officer McConnelly. At this time, the fire department had arrived on scene and were under instructions not to enter the house until it was cleared by law enforcement. So imagine what they were thinking when McConnelly brought an unarmed civilian into the home to clear the house with him. Stewart led him to the basement where Betty-Ann's body was, and the first thing Officer McConnelly saw was her feet, and then the rest of her body would appear. By the time Officer McConnelly cleared the house, other officers had arrived and secured a perimeter, and Detective Paul Hart would show up to investigate the murder and arson and would start in the basement where Betty-Ann's body was. He wanted to start there because there he knew two things. A woman in her late 30s, presumably Betty-Ann Sullivan, was possibly murdered, and her son Tommy was missing. Although it was pretty obvious to Detective Hart that Betty-Ann had been murdered. Detective Hart immediately put an APB out on Tommy, presuming he had been kidnapped. That was Hart's working theory at the time until evidence told him otherwise. His gut, however, would tell him that the husband did it. However, the problem with that theory was that Thomas Sr. didn't have any blood on him, which, with the brutality of the murder of Mrs. Sullivan, he would have had blood on him. Mr. Sullivan also went to help find Mrs. Sullivan and put out the fire, and he seemed extremely distraught and having trouble what he was going to tell his 8-year-old son. Also, if Thomas Sr. had committed the murder, he would have acted a lot more calm and shown no emotion. This would lead to two big questions that still have yet to be answered. Who killed Betty-Ann Sullivan, and where was her oldest son, Tommy? I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service, and it's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. Nor do you have to try and fit in an appointment into your already hectic schedule. First, it's easy to get down this time of year, and we all need someone who can understand what you're going through and can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer a few simple questions about your needs and preferences in therapy. I know the questions seem never-ending and take forever, but there's a reason for that. BetterHelp just wants to be able to match you with the therapist that's right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with the one that you have, or maybe they're not fitting your needs, then you can change your therapist at any time with BetterHelp at no additional cost. You also don't have to wait any period of time to switch your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, then you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time. And as I mentioned earlier, you can schedule live sessions with your therapist when it's convenient for you and your schedule. They're there for you on your time. With BetterHelp, you'll get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, more scheduling flexibility, and more affordable pricing. If you go to their website and use code betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know you heard it at the campfire, but you'll receive 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. And I'll also provide a link into the show notes. As Detective Hart began running the scene and taking everything in, he began reading few of the papers that hadn't burned up yet, as well as the book covers in the living room, and started making connections and connecting the dots. He started to believe that this was cult-related and that the young Tommy Jr. was in a kind of danger that no one wanted to fathom. While Thomas Sullivan Sr. and Brian were at the police station under medical observation, the police, fire department, and volunteers searched for Tommy Jr. with no luck as morning would come. Detective Hart was in his office looking at the preliminary forensic report and concluded that Mrs. Sullivan was struck in the back of the head, giving her multiple skull fractures, causing her to lose consciousness and potentially even death. A 25-pound dumbbell was found by her body that appeared to be the weapon to cause the head injury. Mrs. Sullivan was also found to have dozens of stab wounds to her face, neck, chest, and torso areas. The weapon used to stab her hadn't been found yet at this time. Forensics was determined, though, that the killer was right-handed based off the injuries of Betty-Ann. But that wouldn't be the end of Betty-Ann's injuries. Her eyes would be carved out with a knife as well. This murder was personal, and the body had been moved either during the attack or immediately after the attack. This crime was showing all the signs of being a crime of passion, and Detective Hart was leaning back towards the husband being the killer, or the very least being involved somehow. Then continuing on page 2 of the preliminary report, Detective Hart would read something that seemed to defy any sort of logic. He had to take a double check that the report to make sure that it wasn't a typo. Detective Hart had seen cases where late-night calls, crime scene analysts would check blood smear instead of blood spatter, or vice versa. Looking at the crime scene photos of blood smear on the wall just below the ceiling was about 8 feet high. If it was blood splatter, then that made sense because bladder will go anywhere and everywhere. But a smear would mean that the individual would have had to possess a great amount of strength to get, most likely, an unconscious Betty-Ann Sullivan that high off the ground after the initial attack. So his working theory Detective Hart was working with was that there was 2 assailants that could have been able to lift Betty-Ann Sullivan that high with their combined strengths. This is when Detective Hart would come up with the theory that there was 2 killers out there that he had to find. It was a sleepless night for Mr. Eastman, Thomas Sullivan Sr.'s neighbor, with the lights of police cars and news agencies in the area and the whole event in general. He was brewing his coffee, looking out his kitchen window into the backyard, when something caught his eye. He put his boots on and took a cup of coffee outside with him to get a closer look, and it would take a minute for him to process what he was seeing. Laying up against a stacked pile of firewood was another body that had soaked the snow with blood. The body had a deep cut to the wrist, and the throat had been cut from ear to ear. Mr. Eastman was frozen in his tracks until his mind finished processing what he saw. Mr. Eastman would recognize the person that was laying lifeless in his backyard. It was Tommy Sullivan, Jr. Mr. Eastman was smart enough, or maybe scared enough, to not go near Tommy's body and preserve the crime scene in his backyard when he would call the police. This would be when Detective Hart would receive a phone call that Tommy Sullivan had been found, but was it the news he wanted to hear? When Detective Hart got to the Eastman's house and went around back, he could clearly see only one set of footprints leading to the firewood pile from the woods where Tommy's body was, and that there wasn't any prints leading in or out. This would come to find to be Tommy's footprints, where he was able to observe the removal of his mother's body and the chaos that had gone on the night before Tommy had taken his own life. Tommy used his pocket knife from the Boy Scouts to cut his wrist and his throat. Detective Hart wouldn't need forensic confirmation to know that the knife in Tommy's hand was the same knife used to also kill Betty-Ann Sullivan. All the pieces were coming together now for Detective Hart, and he would find that Tommy had killed his mother, but both him and the coroner doubted suicide to Tommy's cause of death because of the sheer brutality of it. Tommy's father would tell Detective Hart that at Thanksgiving, Tommy was his normal self and everything was fine, and in the course of 6 short weeks became obsessed with satanic and occult worship and turned into what he had become. The following morning, Detective Hart would find another piece of evidence sitting on his desk that would perhaps explain the events that unfolded with the death of Betty-Ann Sullivan and Tommy Sullivan, Jr. He would find a handwritten contract between Tommy and the Great Demon of Hell written in Tommy's handwriting, and the Great Demon of Hell would call for the death of Tommy's whole family as well as taking his own life. This note wouldn't be the only note that Tommy would write. According to a subreddit, Tommy wrote to his best friend and another friend of theirs in school a note as well. According to the subreddit, it was described that it went into detail about how Tommy was going to hell and that one day he would return for both of them. It was said it gave the friend nightmares, traumatizing him for a while. And after the murder-suicide, the community was in disbelief, and everyone who knew Tommy were shocked by the news, saying that Tommy had appeared normal to them in the months and days leading up to the murder-suicide. And after all this took place, Tommy would become known as a different name, the Jersey Devil. So that's going to be it for the first case of 2024. I hope everyone had a great New Year's and Christmas. The show has grown exponentially in the 14 short months of doing the podcast, and we've been reaching a global audience since basically the start of the show. I always like to look to see what countries check out the podcast, so in the month of December, up until now, so far the top countries listening to the podcast is the United States at number 1, Australia is taking number 2 spot, which they've been in the top 3 for a few months now. Canada is the number 3 spot, with the UK taking the 4th spot, and Spain and Bulgaria are both the new country listeners tied for 5th spot, rounding out the top 5. So thank you everyone who has checked out the show regularly and been following since the beginning. And if you are just starting, then feel free to start from the beginning or the most recent and work your way backwards. When I started the show, I did not think I would reach a global audience, but here we are. So that concludes this case at the campfire, and I know there's more information that I didn't include in this story, as there is a lot of information to cover. All resources used to gather information for the case include, but not limited to, news articles, reports, documentaries, as well as other sources. I appreciate everyone who has gathered by the campfire with me for this case. Also, I'm working on a different bonus content feature to where subscribers can access everything in one place wherever you get your podcast. You can still find the bonfire and the after party over on Patreon for a cup of coffee per month and a half a cup of coffee for the after party. I appreciate all the support from all the listeners and supporters. Also, if you wish to support the show but don't want to necessarily sign up for a subscription, you can support the show with the S'mores Fund through the website campfirecrimechronicles.com. A link will be provided in the show notes. Thanks for joining me for the first episode of 2024. Join me next time in 2 weeks as we gather around the campfire for the next case that we dive into. Remember to sleep with one eye open. I'm your host, Kevin, and this is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast.